February 2nd, 1966, Sun Valley, Idaho. The divorce proceedings took 12 minutes, room sealed, no press. When it ended, Patricia Kennedy, sister of the murdered president, was pulled through the back exit and into a waiting limousine before a single photographer got a frame. 12 minutes, to dissolve a 12-year marriage. Inside the most famous Catholic family in American political history, that is not a divorce, that is an extraction. Patricia was not the only one. All three of JFK's sisters who married, Patricia, Eunice, and Jean, entered unions the public record shows were shaped by forces no wedding photograph captured. Dynastic pressure. Institutional silence. Husbands absorbed so completely into the Kennedy machine, the line between a marriage and a political deployment became impossible to locate. Look at the wedding geography alone. Patricia married Peter Lawford on April 24, 1954, at the Church of St. Thomas More, East 89th Street, New York City. 3,000 spectators pressed the barriers outside. That number does not gather for a wedding, it gathers for a display. Eunice married Sergeant Shriver on May 23, 1953, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Shriver had been employed by the Kennedy family since 1946, 7 years inside their orbit before he stood at that altar. Jean married Stephen Edward Smith on May 19, 1956, also St. Patrick's Cathedral. Smith ran the finances of JFK's 1960 campaign, Robert's 1968 campaign, and Ted's 1980 campaign. Every major Kennedy political operation for 30 years ran through Jean's husband. 3 sisters, 3 institutional arrangements dressed as love stories. That is the audit. Not the dresses, the structure underneath, and what it cost each of them. Before we go further, subscribe now, because by the end of this audit, you are going to see the exact moment one of these women buried her brother and then ran a major international event 45 days later without issuing a single word about what it cost her. Share this with someone who still thinks the Kennedy family was a fairy tale. It was a machine, and these women were inside it. Patricia Helen Kennedy, born May 6, 1924, in Brookline, Massachusetts, 4th daughter, 9 children total in the Kennedy household. The family's own characterization of her, the most sophisticated of the daughters, and simultaneously the most introverted. She graduated from Rosemont College in 1945. Her documented ambition was film production, not politics, not campaigning, not hostessing for a brother's White House. Film. She did not get that. What she got was Hollywood adjacency. In 1949, her brother Jack introduced her to Peter Lawford, English-born MGM contract actor, member of Frank Sinatra's inner circle, naturalized U.S. citizen as of April 27, 1960. They married on April 24, 1954. The couple acquired a beach house in Santa Monica, California. By the time Jack Kennedy won the presidency in November 1960, that beach house was no longer a home. It was a node in the Kennedy campaign apparatus. Strategy sessions happened there. Sinatra visited. Marilyn Monroe visited. The entertainment industry's financial pipeline to the Democratic Party ran through that address. Patricia's stated career ambition, film production, does not appear in any documented form during the marriage. Not one project, not one credit. What appears instead is a campaign schedule, a hostessing calendar. 4 children born between 1955 and 1961. Christopher, Sydney, Victoria, Robin. 4 children in 6 years, in a house that was simultaneously a political operations center. Now, here is where it gets structurally strange. By 1963, 2 things happened in rapid succession that broke the operating logic of the Lawford marriage entirely. First, John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas. Peter Lawford's primary social value, his Kennedy connection, evaporated overnight. His film career had already been declining since the late 1950s. He was now a man whose main asset was a relationship to a dead president. Second, Robert Kennedy had already begun distancing himself from Lawford over events surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death on August 4, 1962. The Kennedy family was withdrawing, and Patricia was still inside the marriage. By 1964, Patricia moved herself and the 4 children out of Santa Monica to a New York apartment. No announcement, no statement, no spokesperson. She simply left California, and the press did not know for months. The legal paper trail from that period shows a gap that is itself a data point. And what fills it in January 1966 is one of the most precisely managed public relations maneuvers in Kennedy family history. Eunice Mary Kennedy. Born July 10, 1921, Brookline, the 3rd Kennedy daughter, she built something entirely her own before marriage intervened. A sociology degree from Stanford in 1943, a role in the Special War Problems Division of the U.S. State Department, a position at the Department of Justice running a juvenile delinquency project. Then Alderson, West Virginia, 1950, she worked as a social worker inside the Federal Reformatory for Women. That is not a resume built on the family name. That is a woman constructing an independent professional identity, case by case, institution by institution. Then, in January 1953, she attended Mass with a long-time acquaintance. At a side altar, after the service ended, she turned to him and said, documented in her authorized biography, "Sergeant Shriver, I think I'd like to marry you." Eunice proposed. This is verified, but here is the detail the biography buries. Sergeant Shriver had been working for Joseph Kennedy Sr. since 1946, 7 years. He managed the Kennedy-owned merchandise mart in Chicago. He had collaborated with Eunice directly on government anti-delinquency work in Washington in 1947. When Eunice proposed to him at that altar, she was proposing to a man the Kennedy family had already professionally shaped for nearly a decade. She did not marry an outsider. She married someone the institution had pre-approved, pre-vetted, and pre-integrated, whether that represents the freedom to choose or the architecture of a very sophisticated constraint. That question is not answered anywhere in the public record. Jean Ann Kennedy, born February 20, 1928, Boston, the 8th of 9 Kennedy children. She attended the Convent of the Sacred Heart, then Manhattanville College, where she graduated in 1949 with a degree in English. Here is what the record shows about Jean's social intelligence before marriage ever entered the picture. At Manhattanville, she befriended Ethel Skakel, who would marry Robert Kennedy in 1950. She befriended Joan Bennett, who would marry Edward Kennedy in 1958. Jean Kennedy was the personal connection point for 2 of her brother's most consequential relationships. She was the family's social architect. That is not a minor role. It is the kind of role that, in any other institutional context, would come with a title. What it came with instead was a wedding. She married Stephen Edward Smith on May 19, 1956, at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Manhattan. Smith was a Georgetown graduate from a wealthy Brooklyn family. His grandfather had founded a transportation company, and within 4 years of marrying Jean, he was serving as finance chairman and political advisor to John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign. By the time that campaign was over, Stephen Smith was effectively the Kennedy family's internal CFO and political fixer. He ran Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign. He managed Edward Kennedy's 1980 presidential run. Every major Kennedy political operation for the next 3 decades moved through him. And Jean moved through the campaign schedules alongside her brothers. She traveled the country for Jack in 1960. She appeared at events. She maintained the family's social networks. She had 4 children, Stephen Jr. in 1957, William in 1960, Amanda in 1967, Kim in 1972. Her own public career did not begin until 1993. She was 65 years old when President Clinton nominated her U.S. ambassador to Ireland. 65, a woman with a documented gift for political organization, social architecture, and institutional relationship building, and 37 years of that capacity went entirely into campaigns with her name nowhere on the ballot. 3 women, 3 compressed trajectories, 3 variations on the same mechanism. The Kennedy name did not expand a woman's life. It organized it. The Patricia Kennedy Lawford marriage did not end in one event. It decomposed. Peter Lawford's MGM career was in visible decline by 1957. The studio system was breaking apart. His Rat Pack social standing, which had been his real currency, depended on Frank Sinatra's goodwill. And Sinatra's relationship with the Kennedys, already complicated by politics and personality, fractured publicly in 1962 when the Kennedy administration declined to stay at Sinatra's Palm Springs compound during a California visit. Sinatra had spent substantial money preparing for that visit. The security explanation was cited publicly, but accounts from inside that circle described Sinatra's response as a cold, lasting severance. He did not perform in venues where Peter Lawford was present. That is a documented pattern, verified across multiple accounts of the period. Lawford's social utility, to Sinatra's circle, to the entertainment industry, to the Kennedy political operation, was collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. Then, August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe died at her Brentwood home. Peter Lawford was among the last people she reportedly spoke with that evening. The precise chain of events surrounding her death has been disputed for decades. What is not disputed is this. Robert Kennedy, who had served as U.S. Attorney General since January 1961, blamed Lawford for mismanaging the situation. The Kennedy family began pulling back. Patricia was inside a marriage that her own family was now treating as a liability. Think about the geometry of that for a second. Then, November 22, 1963, Dallas. The president was killed. Lawford's primary connection to power, his brother-in-law in the White House, was gone. His film career was gone. Sinatra was gone. The family was withdrawing. And the drinking was accelerating. Patricia Seton Lawford Stewart, Peter Lawford's fourth wife, who wrote about the marriage in documented detail, stated directly, Peter would bring women home all the time when he was married to Patricia. Persistent infidelity, throughout the 12 years, documented in multiple biographies. Christopher Kennedy Lawford, the only son Patricia bore in that marriage, published Symptoms of Withdrawal in 2005. He wrote about mugging women for drug money, panhandling at Grand Central Station, 2 drug possession arrests. He traced the roots of his addiction directly to the household of the early 1960s, the Santa Monica Beach house, the substance-normalized social environment, the father whose own escalating alcoholism modeled a way of living that Christopher spent decades trying to escape. He got sober at age 30 in 1986. He died of a heart attack in Vancouver on September 4, 2018. He was 63 years old. He was trying to open a recovery center. The documentation of Patricia's marriage does not stop at 1966. It extends through her son's body, through his memoir, through his death, across 50 years. If you think the mechanics of that slow collapse are striking, subscribe now and share this, because what Jean Kennedy Smith's documented record reveals next operates on a completely different kind of silence, and it lasted 3 times as long. Patricia arrived in Sun Valley, Idaho, in late December 1965 for a skiing holiday with Robert Kennedy's family. Jacqueline Kennedy joined later. When they all departed after the new year, Patricia stayed. 6 weeks of Idaho residency established legal standing for a divorce under Idaho state law. The divorce was filed February 2, 1966. The proceedings lasted 12 minutes. Peter Lawford told reporters afterward he was surprised by the speed of the court action. He had no further comment. Patricia was 41 years old. She relocated to New York permanently. She never remarried. Her son Christopher asked her, on the record, if she would speak about what Peter was like as a young man. She refused. He reported later that she had told people, with bitterness, that Peter Lawford had destroyed her life. She refused to say more. Let us pause the historical analysis for a moment, to speak plainly. I have spent a significant amount of time inside this record. The court documents, the memoir excerpts, the contemporaneous press archives, the biographies. And what I keep returning to is this. Patricia Kennedy Lawford was, by every account, a highly intelligent woman who wanted to make films. Instead, she spent 12 years in a California beach house that functioned as a Kennedy political relay station, raising 4 children while her husband drank and brought other women home. When the political utility of that household expired, when JFK died, when Sinatra cut ties, when Robert pulled back, the support structure around the marriage evaporated. Patricia was left with the consequences and none of the institutional coverage. She walked out the back door of an Idaho courthouse at 41 years old, and she never spoke about it again. Not to the press, not to her own son. That refusal is not a small thing. It is the entire shape of what the Kennedy name required of its women, even in their most private suffering, silence. Which brings us to the woman for whom that silence lasted not 12 years, but 34. June Kennedy Smith's marriage is the hardest to document. Not because less happened, because more of it was controlled. Stephen Edward Smith died at his Manhattan home on August 19, 1990, lung cancer. He was 62. Their marriage had lasted 34 years. 4 children, Stephen Jr., William, Amanda, Kim. It did not end in divorce. It ended in a hospital. But the 34 years between the 1956 wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral and the 1990 death in Manhattan were not simply quiet. Kennedy family biographers document Stephen Smith's extramarital behavior as consistent with the pattern established by the Kennedy brothers-in-law as a cohort. It was an open fact inside the family structure, known to those closest to them, and Jean Kennedy Smith, a devout Catholic who had been raised inside an institution that did not recognize divorce, stayed. Her own career, her own independent public identity, did not exist in any documented form until 1993. The Kennedy family had structured her utility entirely around the operations of other people. She crossed the country for Jack's 1960 campaign on a schedule documented in contemporaneous press accounts. She campaigned for Robert, for Ted. She introduced her brothers to Ethel Skakel and Joan Bennett, the women who became their wives, the 2 most consequential personal introductions in Kennedy family history, and received no institutional recognition for either of them. Jean was the family's social infrastructure. Invisible by design, her own name, June Kennedy Smith, diplomat, author, humanitarian, did not appear in that sequence until she was 65 years old. In her 2016 memoir, The 9 of Us, she described her Kennedy childhood as unexceptional. That word, from that woman, in that family, is not modesty. It is information, but the documented public record from 1991 shows the precise moment when Jean's decades of managed privacy became impossible to maintain. April 6, 1991. Her son, William Kennedy Smith, was accused of rape at the Kennedy family's Palm Beach compound. The trial began in December 1991. It was broadcast nationally. Jean Kennedy Smith sat in the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Her son was acquitted on December 11, 1991. She made no public statement. Before the trial, during the trial, after the acquittal, nothing. 37 years of institutional silence, and it held even then. Eunice Kennedy Shriver's marriage is the structural counterpoint, and it is the most complicated of the 3 to analyze accurately. The Shriver union lasted 56 years, May 23, 1953 to August 11, 2009, when Eunice died. No divorce, no separation, no public fracture. Sergeant Shriver's biographer Scott Stossel wrote the most precise summary of the internal dynamic in the authorized biography. Sarge regards serving Eunice and serving God. Eunice regards Sarge as her spiritual and intellectual anchor. Theirs is a formidable marriage. Pass that carefully. Sarge serves Eunice. Eunice is anchored by Sarge. 2 different verbs, 2 different power positions, both pointing at Eunice. Eunice founded the Special Olympics in Chicago in July 1968. She drove the establishment of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development in 1962. She pushed the Kennedy Jr. Foundation to fund a national network of intellectual disability research centers, beginning in 1967. This is the documented output of a woman who had built a professional identity before marriage and continued building it afterward, through and around the Kennedy institutional structure. But here is the date that the record almost glosses over. June 5, 1968. Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The Shrivers were in Paris. Sargent had been serving as U.S. Ambassador to France since March 6, 1968. Eunice was with him. She flew home for the funeral. Then, 6 weeks later, she ran the first International Special Olympics Games at Soldier Field in Chicago. 6 weeks. In public photographs from July 20, 1968, Eunice Kennedy Shriver is present, energized, directing. Her brother had been shot dead less than 2 months before. The event ran. The cameras rolled. The record shows competence so complete it looks, from the outside, like the absence of grief. It was not the absence of grief. It was the presence of a discipline that the Kennedy Institution had been installing since childhood. You perform. You continue. The name requires it. Think about what it takes to absorb that. A brother shot dead in a hotel kitchen, a transatlantic flight for the funeral, a return to Paris, diplomatic duties resumed, and then Chicago, Soldier Field, athletes on the track, cameras rolling. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, standing in the July heat, running the event she had spent years building, 5.5 weeks after the second assassination of a Kennedy brother in her lifetime. No breakdown in the public record, no documented pause, no statement to the press about what that period cost her personally. What the historical archive shows is a woman who had learned, through the full weight of everything the Kennedy name demanded, that the institution did not stop for grief. And neither, publicly, did she. What that cost her is in no public document. That gap is the story. January 14, 1966. That week, Time magazine ran a brief item in its People section. The substance: Peter Lawford denied any legal separation from Patricia Kennedy Lawford. The only split, he explained through representatives, was geographical. His film work kept him in Hollywood, while Patricia remained in Manhattan with their 4 children. Read that sentence again: geographical. On that same date, Peter Lawford's own Manhattan attorney announced to the press what he called an amicable separation. 2 statements, same week, one denying the separation was real, one acknowledging it while managing the characterization. The word amicable, doing the work that geographical could no longer sustain. Patricia was in Sun Valley, skiing. She issued nothing, said nothing. Her silence was so complete, the public record contains no attributed statement from her about the marriage's end, not that week, not that year, not in the 4 decades she lived afterward. Now here is where the calendar does something precise. The Lawfords had publicly appeared together as recently as the Kennedy White House years, photographed at events, part of the Camelot social machinery. The wedding had drawn 3,000 people to East 89th Street in New York. The beach house had hosted the President of the United States. And by January 1966, the same week Lawford's lawyers were issuing contradictory statements to the press, Patricia was quietly establishing Idaho residency requirements for a no-contest divorce. The gap between the public image and the private mechanics is not months, it is years. The marriage was functionally over by 1964, when Patricia left California. The press reported it in January 1966. The divorce was finalized February 2, 1966. 2 full years of maintained public ambiguity, managed through lawyer statements, strategic silence, and the institutional capacity of the Kennedy family to control information about itself. Now take June 5, 1968. Eunice Kennedy Shriver is in Paris. Her husband is serving as U.S. Ambassador to France. Robert Kennedy wins the California Democratic primary that night. Then, the Ambassador Hotel, the shooting. By the morning of June 6, Robert Kennedy is dead. Eunice flies home, attends the funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York on June 8, buries her brother, then flies back across the Atlantic, resumes the ambassador's residence schedule, and 6 weeks later runs the first International Special Olympics Games in Chicago. On July 20, 1968, at Soldier Field, the public photographs show Eunice Kennedy Shriver smiling, moving through the crowd, running the event she had spent years organizing. Her brother had been dead for 45 days. There is no private record from that period in any public archive. No diary entry, no authorized interview in which she describes what those 6 weeks felt like inside the Paris residence, resuming diplomatic duties while processing the second assassination of a brother in 5 years. The public photograph is all that exists. It shows competence. It shows presence. It shows the Kennedy sisters' version of what a marriage to this dynasty demanded. Not just loyalty to a husband, but total, continuous functional performance. At a level of pressure most people are never required to demonstrate, even once. And Jean Kennedy Smith, January 20th, 2011, the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's inaugural address. A ceremony at the U.S. Capitol. Jean was there, photographed, 82 years old. Every press account that day identified her the same way, the last surviving sibling of President Kennedy. Not the woman who spent 34 years, married to the strategist who ran 4 Kennedy presidential campaigns. Not the woman who sat in a Florida courtroom for weeks in 1991 watching her son tried on national television. Not the diplomat who spent 5 years facilitating peace negotiations in Northern Ireland. Not the author. Not the humanitarian. The last surviving sibling. That is the public inversion at its most distilled. 3 women, 3 decades of documented private load, and a press record that reached past all of it, every single time, to land on the name they were born with. Not who they were, whose they were. Close the file on each of them, coldly, in order. Patricia Kennedy Lawford, February 2, 1966, the courthouse back exit. She returned to New York permanently, raised 4 children in a Manhattan apartment without their father. Peter Lawford died on December 24, 1984, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 61. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Contributing factors documented in medical records: kidney failure, liver failure, both directly attributable to decades of alcohol and drug abuse. He died in debt. Not modest debt. Significant debt. Patricia outlived him by 22 years. She died September 17, 2006, in New York City. She was 82. Buried at Southampton Cemetery in Southampton, New York. She never spoke about the marriage, not to journalists, not to biographers, and according to her son Christopher's public statements, not to him directly either. Christopher Kennedy Lawford published Symptoms of Withdrawal in 2005. He detailed drug possession arrests, street-level addiction, years of functional collapse. He got sober in 1986 at age 30. He became a recovery advocate and author. He died of a heart attack on September 4, 2018, in Vancouver, Canada. He was 63. He had been preparing to open a recovery center. The documented downstream effects of what happened inside the Santa Monica beach house in the early 1960s reach from a California divorce in 1966 to a Vancouver hospital in 2018. That is a 52-year paper trail, with names on it: Jean Kennedy Smith. Stephen Smith died August 19, 1990, at his Manhattan home. Lung cancer. He was 62. Edward Kennedy's eulogy at the dedication of the Stephen E. Smith Center at the JFK Library on February 4, 1991, described him as the wisest advisor, the most skillful campaign manager, and the best friend that any of us ever had. Ted Kennedy's words about Jean's husband. At a library named after Jean's brother, Jean was appointed U.S. Ambassador to Ireland on March 17, 1993. She served through September 1998. She worked on the framework that contributed to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, a documented diplomatic achievement that her State Department record confirms. She wrote a memoir in 2016. She died June 17, 2020, at her Manhattan home. She was 92, Her daughter Kim confirmed the death to the New York Times. She was described in every obituary as the last surviving sibling of President Kennedy, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She died August 11, 2009, in Hyannis, Massachusetts. She was 88. Buried at St. Francis Xavier Parish Cemetery, Centerville, on Cape Cod. The Special Olympics she founded in 1968 now operates in more than 190 countries. The Federal Research Institute she helped create in 1962 was renamed in her honor in 2007, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Her name is on a federal building. It is in the U.S. Code. Sergeant Shriver survived her by 2 years. He died January 18, 2011, at age 95. Now here is the full account in its simplest form. One marriage ended in an Idaho courthouse in 12 minutes. One ended in a Manhattan bedroom after a cancer diagnosis. One ended only when one partner stopped breathing after 56 years. All 3 women gave more to the institution than the institution returned. The record confirms it. Quietly, without melodrama, just dates, names, and the documented shape of what was asked of them. That is the audit. Closed.